Hi, my name is Christy Wissink, and I'm a licensed independent mental health practitioner at Restore, Rebuild, Reconnect Counseling Center in Omaha, Nebraska. We are wanting to make some resources for our fellow clinicians and for those in the people helping fields to help mitigate burnout and compassion fatigue. This video is a first part in two-part series on the brain and body connection and the understanding of collective trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma, especially as those have been impacted in the last 5 years by the pandemic. These kind of three interrelated phenomena really affect us as behavioral health providers in such profound ways. And these experiences have always been there in our profession, but the COVID-19 pandemic really illuminated and intensified them in ways that we really actually are still kind of processing through. Our goal in this session and this video is not only to define these terms, but also understand how they live within us personally, somatically, and professionally. And we'll look at how they shape our bodies and our nervous systems and how they influence our worldview, practice, and how, if really left unacknowledged, it can lead us to some burnout. We'll then consider practical strategies for awareness, regulation, and resilience. So let's begin with collective trauma. This term really describes the psychological and emotional distress experienced by groups of people following kind of disruptive or catastrophic events. So unlike individual trauma, which resides in one person's experience, collective trauma is communal. It alters our communities. It alters how entire communities think, feel, and behave. In a 2018 study, Hirschberger writes that collective trauma is a cataclysmic event that shatters the basic fabric of society. It becomes a crisis of meaning, transforming into collective memory, and eventually a system of meaning that redefines who groups are and where they are going. So importantly, this memory persists beyond direct survivors, reshaping subsequent generations. So if you think about it, the Holocaust, world wars are some major events that come to mind when we think of collective trauma. But today, COVID-19 has really etched itself into our shared narrative as a global event. It disrupted the very rhythms of our lives. It questioned our sense of safety, our trust in institutions, and even our connections with one another. For us as clinicians, this matters deeply because collective trauma changes the dynamic between relationship of therapist and client. So normally we listen with some kind of separation of what events going on, but during COVID-19, we were living the exact same event. When clients spoke of isolation, grief, fear of illnesses, those words reverberated in us because we were experiencing them too simultaneously. It was not that we had prior experience with such an event. Experiencing the pandemic in real time with our clients just led to another level of experiencing collective trauma for us as clinicians. So research describes this overlap as shared trauma, whereas therapists and clients face the same stressors simultaneously. This kind of blurring of boundaries increased the emotional intensity of our sessions and creating new actual vulnerabilities within our work. So as these dynamics extended beyond COVID, political unrest, mass shootings, social violence are also functioning as collective traumas in our communities, altering the backdrop of our kind of therapeutic encounters. If you go back on our website, you can find another video series on shared trauma and kind of how that showed up differently as we parallel processed with our clients in real time what we're experiencing. So in addition to collective trauma that a clinician may experience due to events within our community or, broader world as we experienced with the pandemic, another dynamic to be mindful of as a clinician is that of secondary trauma, which also could be known as secondary traumatic stress or STS. Maybe you've seen that abbreviation. So unlike collective trauma, which is shared broadly across the community, secondary trauma is more individualized. It occurs when we kind of absorb the emotional residue of repeatedly hearing clients' stories of pain and trauma. So Science Direct actually describes STS as an emotional duress that results when individuals hear about firsthand trauma experiences of another. The symptoms also often mirror post-traumatic stress, which can include intrusive images, hyperarousal, avoidance, disturbed sleep, and even emotional numbing. But this isn't just like a psychological event. those symptoms are both psychological and physiological. Our nervous systems really respond through and though the danger as described in session were happening to us. And so the body holds that stress. So we could be headaches, digestion, upset stomach, muscle tension, fatigue that actually lingers long before and after a session ends. If you know you're about to enter into a heavy client session, those symptoms may start even before you see the client and then may linger after that session ends. Secondary traumatic stress is widespread, unfortunately, among health professionals, and we saw such an uptick in that after and through the pandemic. It's strongly linked to burnout, reduced empathy, and long-term health risks actually as our nervous system continue to hold that stress. But this actually, just as a reminder, is not a reflection of poor boundaries or weakness. It is kind of an empathy injury to our nervous system of sustained hyperarousal within an empathetic setting. So without the release of that stress and tension from our nervous system, there is longer term impacts from the secondary traumatic stress. So maybe consider this. So a client describes a violent accident in detail, and as you listen, you notice your jaw tighten, your breath become more shallow, your heart rate begins to quicken. This mirroring is really natural. It reflects the nervous system attunement with another human's distress. But over time, without awareness or recovery, these moments begin to accumulate and they become an unseen weight, impacting both our professional presence as well as our personal well-being. So acknowledging secondary trauma in our lives and not pathologizing ourselves, it is normalizing the toll of this work, and it opens the door for more intentional self-care. So being able to name what we are experiencing can create the space for choice, and we can utilize grounding, potential supervision, peer consultation, other routines that allow us to kind of release that stress that maybe our nervous systems are carrying. So just kind of transitioning a little bit to vicarious trauma, very similar, but while secondary trauma tends to appear as acute reactions within the body, vicarious trauma is more cumulative, developing over time as a repeated exposure to trauma stories. It kind of actually reshapes our worldview. It's really, it's been shared and described as an occupational hazard of caring. So like secondary trauma, vicarious trauma shows up somatically. So it can show up as chronic headaches, sleep disruption, digestion issues, lower immunity or tension that never seems to ease. So it extends beyond the body actually for vicarious trauma into the realm of meaning and worldview. And that's why it can become so dangerous and of a huge risk to compassion fatigue and burnout. Clinicians experiencing vicarious trauma often report increased cynicism, loss of hope, or questioning their professional purpose. It's not just simply exhaustion, it's existential. So COVID-19 really magnified these effects. We are not only carrying our clients' pain, but also our own grief, uncertainty, and fear. And really many of us began questioning the systems around us, our trust in institutions, and really even, unfortunately, the sustainability of our work. As the pandemic converged within our systemic demoralization, and even before COVID, like healthcare systems were strained. Efficiency, they were really efficiency driven. Sometimes, unfortunately, could be dismissive of the human toll that the clinician or doctors or nurses, that human toll of caregiving. And we just saw how COVID completely intensified and magnified this, really almost sometimes leaving many clinicians experiencing actually moral injury, that painful gap between what we know clients needed and what actually we were able to provide. This demoralization does not stay typically at an organizational or systems level. It really seeps into our bodies, into our spirits. It manifests as fatigue, irritability, hopelessness, and despair. And so combined with vicarious trauma, it kind of created a perfect storm during the pandemic. Existential questioning along with physical depletion gave us just kind of the perfect storm for those increased rates of compassion fatigue and burnout. And so what we want to do as clinicians is begin to name that. Naming vicarious trauma and the systemic context gives us a foothold. So trauma-informed care reminds us to practice universal precautions, treating both clients and clinicians vulnerable to trauma. So attending to our bodies, seeking reflective dialogue, and advocating for systemic reform really become professional necessities. So by being able to name the differences and similarities of collective trauma, secondary trauma or secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma, we really are able to begin putting a language to what we experienced or continuing to experience as clinicians. Actually, as yes, we are 5 years technically post-COVID, but the landscape and our normal within our personal and professional lives really has shifted. And so without this language of what we are experiencing on a macro and micro level, it can really be difficult and disorienting to understand and work through our stress levels and experiences, let alone walking alongside our clients. So just quick recap, collective trauma is within our communities, potentially on a greater scale like the pandemic, experiencing the same trauma simultaneously. It is an individual experience as well as a collective traumatic human experience. Secondary trauma or secondary traumatic stress, occurs within an individual as they experience the trauma secondhand. And though they may not be the primary individual, for us as clinicians, we typically aren't the primary individual experiencing the trauma, but being in such close proximity with our clients to the trauma and their sharing of stories actually can have lingering effects on us. So for us as clinicians, this can occur within that therapeutic session and through that therapeutic setting of repeated exposures of clients sharing in traumatic detail within our own sessions. And so then our nervous systems begin to mirror theirs and can take on that traumatic stress if we're not careful. And then in that extension of secondary traumatic stress is that vicarious trauma. And this term, as mentioned, describes the cumulative effect of repeated exposures to traumatic stories or traumatic events if you're in a healthcare setting over time. And this really where it begins to wear down our nervous systems, and without intervention can actually create PTSD-like symptoms, as well as those larger worldview changes within our belief systems. So how do we connect this to our nervous system? So we've defined what these terms are. How does this connect to the body? Let's look at the nervous system through the lens of the polyvagal theory. So Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory gives us a language for something sometimes we as clinicians and our clients, but specifically as we focus on us as our clinicians, often feel, but don't always know how to explain. So that our body responds to the trauma, not only in our clients, but also within ourselves. And so it does through our automatic states of survival. The autonomic nervous system constantly is scanning for cues of safety and threat. And this process is actually called neuroception. And this happens below actually our conscious awareness. Our system is constantly scanning for safety and threat. And so unlike perception, which is constant and conscious and deliberate, neuroception is automatic and unconscious. So it's really kind of that body's built-in surveillance system. It's constantly scanning the environment, the people around us, and even actually our own internal sensations for cues of threat or safety. Hungry, tired, angry, lonely, right? But then within the context of our therapeutic sessions, what is our client sharing? What are the stories coming out? How is the trauma impacting them? And so this process of neuroception happens beneath our awareness. Faster than thought, actually. It determines which nervous state we enter, threat or safety. So when neuroception detects safety, such as there's a warm voice, steady eye contact, or calm environment, which we hope to provide in our settings as clinician, the nervous system supports what's called ventral vagal activation. We feel grounded, socially engaged, able to connect. It's connection state. In contrast, when neuroception picks up a threat, raised voices, chaotic environments, even subtle shifts in posture or tone, it activates those survival pathways within our nervous system. And if the threat seems inescapable, we enter sympathetic fight or flight. If the threat feels overwhelming or inescapable, we drop down into dorsal vagal shutdown. So for clinicians, this explains why we sometimes react strongly to client narratives even before we consciously register why. So a client's story about struggling to breathe while on a ventilator during COVID pandemic, for instance, may instantly trigger sympathetic arousal. Your chest feels tight, your breath quickens, because your neuroception read danger in the imagery your brain started to conjure, even though you are safe in the therapy room. So this helps us understand vicarious trauma. So over time, repeated stories and traumatic exposure can recalibrate neuroception. The nervous system becomes biased towards detecting danger, even in neutral settings like the therapeutic room. So sudden noise in the office, a client's pause before speaking, or even actually our own internal fatigue can really actually misread as cues or threat. This bias then keeps us as clinicians cycling between sympathetic hyperarousal or dorsal collapse, making that ventral state of regulation harder to access. So the hopeful piece of neuroception can also be retrained, right? So the constant grounding practices, safe peer connection, rituals that really reinforce predictability can all provide those cues for safety. So by intentionally surrounding ourselves with signals that support ventral states, steady breath, calming environments, warm voices, we can actually help our nervous system relearn that safety is possible, even though potentially the clients that you have back to back are sharing similar trauma narratives around the pandemic or political violence and unrest. We can consistently and consciously re-regulate back to that ventral state of regulation. So in this way, neuroception becomes not only a risk factor for dysregulation if we're not paying attention, but also that pathway back to resilience. So when we think about neuroception, one of the most powerful things to remember is that it isn't just individual, it's relational. And so our nervous system reads the signals of those around us, and this is where our supervisors, colleagues, consultation groups, our friends even, our family play a really vital role. And by intentionally sending cues of safety, we can help each other regulate and return to those ventral states. So cues of safety can be subtle but powerful. For example, group counselors who begin meetings with a steady, warm tone, voice, invite the group's nervous system to settle. So even within a group system, we have our individual nervous system state, but we also, the group kind of collectively has a state of nervousness. And that's why they say kind of emotional regulation is kind of contagious, where it's anxiety and it's high states of nervousness or hyperarousal can be contagious, but also regulation can be contagious as well. That consistent eye contact, nodding, facial expressions of empathy really tell our body that we are seen and heard. And so even just the physical arrangement of the room can matter. Sitting in a circle rather behind a desk, or sitting, face to face rather than a barrier, can really communicates openness and actually reduces some of that perceived threat for ourselves, but also for our clients. So it really kind of takes us back to those early days of grad school, and basic people helping classes, and active listening actually is all part of that sending cues for safety, not only for our clients but also for our own nervous systems to stay in that state of connection. So in our sessions, when we send cues of safety by slowing down our pace of speech, offering validating reflections, practicing active listening without rushing to problem solve, simple acknowledgments of like, that sounds heavy, I can imagine that was a lot to carry, really send that message that the burden is shared and not isolated. And sometimes in our own simple presence, utilization of the basics, that we can provide that connection needed for our nervous system as well as our clients. So yes, we are providing that felt safety for our clients, but in that same mirroring neurons, which we'll get into part video 2, it helps our nervous systems to also be in a state of connection in that ventral state, will keep us from having that cumulative stress over time. So sometimes safety comes through ritual. If it feels appropriate within a trauma processing session with your client, maybe begin with a brief grounding practice and end with a collective breath. Sometimes predictability and predictability itself, it creates a safety signal to our nervous system, our clients and ours. So not only are we modeling for our clients, but also it is implementing a practice for ourselves. So we got to get, more of a bang for our buck, if that makes sense. So over time, these rituals build trust. It reduces that neuroceptive bias towards danger that develops when we as clinicians are repeatedly exposed to trauma narratives with our clients. Even silence, we've all had those awkward moments of silence, but sometimes silence can actually provide a warmth and cue for safety of we don't have to hurry. There's space here. This is a good space to just slow down and let us sink into this relaxation, which a lot of times even us as clinicians don't get as we rush through notes, as we rush through our personal lives, back-to-back clients. So sometimes even just sitting in that with our clients and modeling that sends those cues of safety to our own nervous systems. So what this means is regulation is not only an inside job, it's something we give and receive with our clients and in community. Supervisors and peer consultations can also send intentional signals of safety. This is something maybe you guys could intentionally practice within your peer consultation or supervision things as you kind of intentionally create practices to recalibrate kind of the neurosystem and the nervous system, everybody in the room as they've rushed in from wherever they are, as they settle into that space, and having maybe some predictability practices can kind of reset that nervous system to be in that ventral state as you begin the actual consultation places. So let's take a few minutes now and break down each state and how it actually can show up in a counseling session. So we have the ventral vagal state, which is the safety and connection. In ventral vagal activation, so the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant in a balanced way. So the vagus nerve, particularly in the myelinated fibers, support calm regulation. So heart rate and breath are steady. Muscles are relaxed and but responsive. Social engagement system is online, meaning eye contact, facial expressions, vocal tone, and even middle ear function are attuned for connection. So when we are in this state, we really feel grounded and capable of relating for clinicians. So for clinicians, the ventral vagal activation allows us to really sit with the heaviness of the trauma narrative without becoming overwhelmed or detached. So those are two things that can happen when you're in some of the other states of hyperarousal or dorsal vagal, which is the collapse. So you can become overwhelmed or detached. And so the goal is really kind of staying in that connection state of ventral vagal. It's this space really where empathy flows without exhaustion because we are really kind of remaining tethered to that safety. During COVID-19, a client might describe grief, missing of family members or missing family gatherings. And so from a ventral vagal state, we can feel the sadness, but also the compassion. We can breathe steadily, offer warmth in our tone, provide that container that they need. You are with them empathetically, feeling the story with them, but you're not feeling drowned by them. Feeling that presence without the overwhelm. On the opposite side, we have the sympathetic state of mobilization, fight or flight. So when the nervous system, that neuroception, perceives danger, it shifts into that sympathetic activation. So the sympathetic branch releases the adrenaline, the cortisol, the heart rate increases, the breathing becomes maybe a little bit more rapid or shallow, tense muscles, the blood flows diverted from digestion to the larger muscle groups. Pupils might even become dilated. It's really kind of that physiology of survival, the fight or flight. There's other things like the freeze and the fawn, but specifically kind of just focusing on the fight or flight. Can we escape this? Clinicians may find themselves here when listening to clients describe really highly activated trauma stories, and in secondary traumatic stress, sympathetic activation might show up as racing thoughts after sessions, trouble sleeping, or physical restlessness. And in collective trauma, really like the early days of COVID, you may recall how every cough in the grocery store kind of heightened your alertness. Or over time, if you live here too often without recovery, that sympathetic activation feeds into that vicarious trauma. So the irritability, the mistrust, the sense that the world is no longer safe. So imagine hearing a client describing being rushed to ICU with COVID, and inside your chest tightens, your breath grows shallow. You picture your own loved ones maybe in that bed, or maybe you even had that experience yourself. And outwardly you keep listening, but your body is bracing for danger that's yours. That's when the sympathetic activation is work, and that's what can cause chronic secondary stress over time. And that's where beginning to name and understand what's happening in our own nervous systems and bodies provides for us choices, clinicians, and ways that we can mitigate those own symptoms within our own life as we kind of release and work through those traumatic states. And when we get into those states of hyperarousal, finding ways to release through ritual and other tools so that you don't stay in that personally in your own personal life, but also professionally. On the flip side, you kind of have the dorsal vagal state, which is shut down and withdrawal. So this is when the nervous system also perceives danger that's actually inescapable or overwhelming. It really shifts into that dorsal vagal state. And this is actually the most primitive survival strategy, like immobilization, like possum play dead, right? The heart rate and the blood actually pressure dropped, digestion slows, muscles collapse into stillness. People often describe it as numbness, fog, disconnection, or exhaustion. This can be more the freeze, sometimes the fawn, depending on how people show up. And for clinicians, that dorsal activation may appear as like going blank during sessions, struggling to muster energy for documentation, which we know we all have, feeling kind of an existential actually despair, some of that systemic moral demoralization. In collective trauma, it might surface when the sheer scale of suffering really feels impossible to hold. And secondary trauma, that repeated exposure to others' pain can really kind of flatten our emotional range. And over time, then that vicarious trauma in the dorsal state actually looks like cynicism, hopelessness, and kind of that painful belief that our work no longer matters. So maybe picture a client recounting how many family members they've lost to COVID, and really instead of feeling anxious or even a calming presence, you feel heavy, foggy, almost frozen. There's a disconnect, a dissociation that almost occurs, and inside you think like, what's the point? Why do we keep doing this? This is too big. That's really the dorsal state kind of starting to take over. And so when we understand our own nervous system and flowing in and out of each state of activation, and this is how we can create our own interventions and practices of resilience, working with clients or when we're in the middle of high stress situations, is that ebb and flow of these states that are part of the human experience. We can't fully every day, all day, be in that ventral state. That's not sustainable, and it's not how the window of tolerance works. It's an up and down, right? We want more an ebb and flow versus those jagged, quick lines. That's where that vicarious long trauma can occur within our systems. But if we are understanding the ebbs and flows of how we are in and out with our nervous systems, it provides that choice, it provides intervention, it provides ways that we can show up resiliency with ourselves and our clients. So when we learn our own reactions within our personal lives as well as professional lives, we can identify how they shift within a client session or a group counseling session, or even in a different setting, depending on what you do within the people helping field. Regulation doesn't always necessarily mean calm, but it does mean that you have access to that thinking brain, that prefrontal cortex, and you understand what state you're in and why you may be in that state. So here are a few steps or ideas to kind of understand and work through some of the shifts within our nervous system. So number one, awareness and naming. That first step is notice. Are you present and steady? That's ventral. Is your heart racing, jaw tight, thoughts starting back and forth? That's more sympathetic. Do you feel numb, foggy, disconnected? That's more dorsal. Simply naming the state actually interrupts that shame and those narratives and actually creates choice for us. Breath. Sometimes I know our clients may get, and even I get annoyed sometimes of like breath work. Okay, and seriously, this is how our bodies understand, because breath is essential for survival. So it's one of those almost direct levers. In sympathetic activation, intentionally lengthening your exhale activates that parasympathetic system, slowing the heart rate. So for example, that 4-second inhale followed by an 8-second exhale, that can help override and start beginning that choice and re-regulation. In the dorsal states, a gentle paced breathing combined with orienting to the room, looking around, being present, can actually begin to wake up the system from that kind of state of freeze. Another really good option is somatic grounding. So small body cues can shift in states. So in sympathetic activation, pressing your feet into the floor, softening your shoulders, tells your body it's supported, it's safe. In dorsal vagal states, opening your posture, right? Lifting your sternum, rolling your shoulders back signals that possibility of re-engagement into the world. Even actually humming or chanting stimulates that vagus nerve, nudging it towards that ventral state, that ventral safety. Orientation to our environment, right? That nervous system often reacts as if danger is present when it's not. And that's for us as clinicians, we are in a safe physical space, but the felt safety is the danger. And so when we reorient to the physical safety, turning our head, looking slowly around the room, naming what you see, that might not necessarily be with a client, but you can do that internally. If you feel yourself starting to engage in one of these states that you don't want to be in, the sympathetic or the dorsal, you can take a second, look down at your notes, look down at your pen if you take notes, or look around at one of the posters within your room. Sends that a message to your nervous system. Okay, we're in a physical safe environment, thus a felt safe environment. This is especially helpful when you kind of feel that frozen or that disconnect. Co-regulation. So our nervous systems really regulate in relationship. So that might be a phone call to a trusted colleague or a friend, family member, a warm look from a peer, shared laugh can really re-anchor us into one of those ventral states. Really, that's why peer consultation, supervisions can be really good protective factors against secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. Another really good one is rituals of closure. That can be with each client or for yourself in between as you're running to the bathroom or refilling your water or coffee. But those small rituals provide the nervous system reset because of the predictability, and that brain is wired for just connection with predictability. So stand up and stretch, wash your hands with mindful breathing, write down one sentence of closure in your notes. These transitions really tell your nervous system that the last story has ended and can help prepare you for the next, right? Because sometimes that cumulative, we've all had those really long back-to-back days when we just schedule them. But when we can kind of create bookends to each client, beginning and ending, it really helps reset the nervous system, thus not creating that cumulative effect of carrying those traumatic stories. So as creative and body practices is another really good one. So practicing art therapy, movement, creative expression really can help restore regulation because they engage the body directly. Drawing, dancing, mindful walking, play, provides that flexibility in our system, otherwise kind of narrowed by trauma or continued exposures to other people's trauma narratives. And really the last one, and that's what this whole video series is about, is systemic awareness. What are we doing within our own nervous systems and understanding nervous systems, how we show up, what state we're in, how our body is showing up with our clients, how our body is showing up in between sessions. Do we have that impending doom as we go to work? Are we resetting as we leave, or we're turning off our computer? Do you have a 5-minute, 2-minute ritual after you shut your computer from telehealth before you re-engage with your family or whatever the next thing is, telling your system that there is an ending and a beginning to the new spaces can be, again, that reorientation, again, to mitigate those cumulative effects. So really, kind of in closing, by understanding the nervous system, we can see that collective trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma are not just abstract ideas. They're not just terms that we throw in with compassion, fatigue, and burnout. They're really lived in our heart rate, in our breath, in our digestion, in our posture, and actually even our very sense of hope in the work that we do. They're really carried in our sympathetic surges, in the dorsal collapses. They're also soothed in those ventral moments of safety and connection. So when we learn how to recognize these states, name them without judgment, gently guide ourselves back to regulation, we don't just protect our own well-being, we model resilience for our clients, showing them that even in the aftermath of overwhelming experience, the body holds pathways back to safety. COVID-19 really illustrates how these dynamics converged. Collective trauma was unavoidable. We were all living the same crisis. Secondary trauma intensified as clients' stories of grief and fear multiplied. And then that vicarious trauma emerged as existential fatigue, many of us actually questioning our meaning and purpose in this work. You know, there's a researcher, Venturis, and he did a research in 2025 that rates of burnout and compassion fatigue and traumatic stress among providers rose so sharply during this period. And because of that loss of natural buffers, commutes, colleague supports, separation of home and work really left clinicians without those essential regulation strategies. And so these outcomes were not failures of individual resilience. They were actually kind of predictable results of overlapping trauma exposures without that sufficient just support, natural support we had in place that we didn't even think maybe was part of our self-care. You know, and so as we create these rituals, as we create these spaces, as we create understanding, we can continue to mitigate the rise of burnout, the rise of compassion fatigue, and help us stay in the space and the work that we truly said yes to, and that we love, and we love helping our people, and we want to be able to stay in this the long haul. So maybe just some practical applications moving forward. Awareness, as I've mentioned multiple times, is part of the first step. But it's also not, awareness is not alone to mitigate the burnout and compassion fatigue. Awareness actually provides that path to response. So some practical ideas moving forward might be structured pauses, as I mentioned before, short breaks between sessions, a few breaths, let that nervous system reset, rituals of closure, that somatic awareness, checking in with your body, noticing how am I holding it in my shoulders, breaths, jaw tight. That professional dialogue, bringing these kind of concepts and things into supervision or consultations, like how am I showing up in my body with my clients and noticing. And then even if it lends itself to you and you have the time or the space, even some organizational advocacy, speaking up for policies, acknowledging how trauma exposure is an occupational hazard in the people helping field. And if you are able and you feel like that is part of the work that you can do, just helping set up systemic supports for those of us in the people helping field. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to do some of these videos, is provide education from a fellow clinician who was in it during COVID-19, and even just another kind of reminder for us of how we can learn and show up with our clients. So to practice what we preach, before we close, I'd like to kind of guide you through a brief grounding practice. So just close your eyes if that feels safe to do so, or soften your gaze. Notice your breath without judgment, without force. Place one hand on your chest and one hand on your abdomen. Feel the warmth of your own touch. Take some slow breaths. Inhale, and potentially imagine some roots grounding you to the earth and the floor beneath you. And as you exhale, release the tension, the heaviness in your chest, the tightness in your jaw, the weight in your shoulders, letting the earth kind of hold it for you. Stay for several breaths, noticing shifts in your body, however subtle. So in summary, collective trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma represent overlapping but distinct realities that shape our work as behavioral health providers. COVID-19 really brought those concepts into sharp relief, but they may remain ongoing part of our professional language. By naming these experiences and understanding their somatic impact, practicing intentional strategies for regulation, we really move towards sustainability in our work. This is not about perfection, it's about compassion for our clients, for our colleagues, and for ourselves. In our next video, we'll kind of deepen our understanding and exploring the neuroscience around trauma and burnout, and then also equipping ourselves with a few more tools to recognize, regulate, and really remain resilient in the face of this ongoing exposure. Thank you.